He had a sense that that was the direction he ought to go, and he went up there as a single. I mean, he was a single man when he went up there, and Ballard Springs, he settled first there, and then later he went on into Logan proper. As a single man, he's made bishop of the Logan 2nd Ward, the 2nd Ward to be organized. In the meantime, Margaret McNeil, her family joins the church in Trenant, Scotland. They make their way over here. She carries on her back her little brother, and she's only 12 years old, 12 or 13, and she's carrying her little brother most of the way because he was sick, and they were just struggling to get here any way they could. And at the mouth of Weber Canyon, Henry Ballard was coming back from a general conference, and he found this little Scotch family that were destitute, the McNeil family. And when he meets Margaret, it's made known to him that she someday is going to be his wife. He fell in love with her, and when she was 16, he wanted to marry her. And Father McNeil, being a Scotchman, when he went to ask for her hand in marriage, said, well, I can't let Margaret go because she's helping us survive here. And so Henry negotiated with his father-in-law how much he would have to pay. And, you know, being a Scotchman, that's what he did. But anyway, they settled the deal for $5 a month until she turned 18. So Henry paid his father-in-law, his Scotch father-in-law, and married Margaret. And then later he took, as a second wife, Margaret's sister. So he had two wives, but he served two missions. They never released him as bishop. And then he was caught with a lot of the other brethren and spent a little time in the penitentiary because of polygamy. I think it was 6 months, and he ran the ward from Salt Lake City. You got called, and they didn't think about releasing you until you died. But later, in his 70s, they released him as bishop and called him to be the state patriarch. Henry, being the bishop, had tremendous interest in the temple. It was his wagon that brought the first load of sand down to the temple site. His wagon also hauled a lot of the stone onto the temple site.
As construction got underway, the Shoshone began to express a real interest in helping to build this special building. And it's interesting, they'd only been Latter-day Saints for a few years by that point, but they really seemed to feel it inside, and they were very anxious for a temple in northern Utah. In 1878, the little settlement at Lemuel's Garden sent 2 Shoshone natives to help work on the temple, and they worked a good portion of the summer. And that proved to be so popular that by 1879, you had 16 Shoshone Latter-day Saints that went over and spent a good portion of the summer in doing whatever they could do to help with this construction. It became, I think, a real hallmark of their dedication and of their faith in Mormonism to be helping with the construction of the temple. So by 1880, this process had really become a wonderful routine. They were also anxious to help build the temple, but they would send work groups of about 6 people, and they would load up in a cart pulled by oxen, or they would go by horse to Collinston, and they would catch the train there that would take them into Cache Valley and to Logan. And they would work for 2 weeks, and then at the conclusion of that, as they returned to their settlement, which at this point was moving from Lemuel's Garden near Tremonton to a new site called Washakie, near the state line with Idaho. As they would return, it was almost a hero's welcome that they would receive. People were so anxious to welcome them back and ask how the construction was going and to get the latest gossip from the big city of Logan. And then the next work group of 6 would be dispatched. The Shoshone, of course, didn't have any professional training in any of the skilled trades, but they were very good at learning. They were very quick to pick up on things. And very quickly they had the Shoshone mixing plaster, mixing mortar, working at the quarry at Franklin. They had other Shoshone that would haul the stone that had been dressed up to the masons so that it could be placed in the walls. And so they really did a lion's share of some of the most physically trying work. At the end of 1883, a statistical summary was run of all of the labor hours that had been provided to that point at the end of 1883 in constructing the Logan Temple. And it was very interesting to see in this report that this little community of Washakie, these Shoshone Latter-day Saints, who had so little of the temporal things that make life comfortable, nevertheless had donated $8,000 worth of labor to the construction of the Logan Temple, and that was based on a working day's wage of $1.25 to $2 per day per person. This was thousands of hours of service.
One of the interesting things is that much of the interior of the temple was furnished by factory-made items, including the carpet. But just a couple of months before the temple was to be completed and dedicated, it was discovered that there was not sufficient factory-made carpet for the temple. And so the brethren in charge of building the temple went immediately to the Relief Society and said, "Can you help us out?" And of course they said we would. And the process was really a community project, because they had to gather the rags from which they made the carpet. They had to sort them out, then they had to weave them together, and they wove them in such large balls that the women couldn't even lift the balls. And then they had to put them together and put the colors in some kind of a form that would make them attractive as well as useful. And they eventually wove and created over 2,000 yards of carpet, nearly 2/3 of the carpet that went into the temple. Not quite all of it was done in 2 months' time for the dedication. There were a couple of rooms that didn't have carpet, but they did finish all of the carpet in the next few days so that the entire temple was carpeted when the temple was dedicated.
Maybe you've heard the tremendous genealogy story that centers around Henry Ballard. He was writing temple recommends for his people, the members of the ward, so that they could go and do work in the temple after it was dedicated. But he was of heavy heart because he didn't have any names. He was there, he and his mother and father were there, and they had no relatives that they could take into the temple. And Brother Merrill writes this in his journal that President Taylor, there's so many people that wanted to be at the dedication, they extended it an extra day or two. And so Henry was writing more recommends, and while he was doing that, his oldest daughter was playing out in the streets, and 2 men stopped her and gave her a newspaper and said, "Here, you take this to your father and don't give it to anyone but him." She went into the house, and her mother said, "You can't disturb father because he's writing recommends." And she said, "No, the men told me I had to give it to Daddy and no one else." And so she let her take the paper in, and he opened it up, and on the back page, a reporter had wandered into the cemetery in Thatcham and had been so impressed with the epitaphs on the headstones that he had written a whole article regarding the headstones, the epitaphs, the names, the dates, and Many of the people that were buried there were Henry's friends and some of his relatives. But when he looked at the date of the newspaper, it was dated May 15th, 1884 in Thatcham, England. And it was in his hand in Logan on May 18th, 1884.
The Logan Temple was dedicated May 17, 1884. People gathered from all over the territory. They came by train. Most of the cars were filled with Latter-day Saints, so there was a huge crowd that came on that May day, and the temple was dedicated by John Taylor, who was the president of the church on that occasion. Brigham Young had died in 1877, so didn't live to see the completion of the Logan Temple. But it becomes then the second temple dedicated in Utah, and is the second oldest continuously working temple in the church. Only St. George is older. And it was a grand and glorious day for the citizens of the Box Elder Stake and the Cache Valley Stake and the Bear Lake Stake, when they could all gather and hear the dedicatory prayer of President Taylor.
When the temple was first opened, it was determined to whitewash it, paint it white, because there were various colors of stone being utilized. But over time, as the paint began to fall away, it was determined that the stone had such integrity and beauty of its own that they let it go back to its natural state. Some of the stones have such beautiful purple, like is discussed in the Purple Mountains Majesties. It's a beautiful color, and the white capping stones set it off so beautifully, and the architectural features stand out so beautifully now that the stones are there in their original form.
You know, it's a wonderful mental picture for me as I think of this dignified, aging Shoshone leader, Sagwitch, entering the temple to do this work, to consider what his life had included. Born in the 1820s in an era when his people really had almost no contact with Anglo settlers, only a few mountain men and trappers, to have that life really pristine, and then to see your world change as the Mormons come and you accommodate them, to see your world change even more as your people are annihilated by federal troops, to embrace a whole new faith, a whole new way of thinking of God, and then to embrace that with such fervor that you help to build this very substantial building as your way of expressing to your God and to your family that this is important to you. And then before you die, to enter that building and to participate in those ordinances that have come to be meaningful to you. That is an incredible cycle of life, and it's amazing that one man could experience so much.
As the temple was being renovated, it was a challenge for me as I watched those magnificent artifacts that had been built there by pioneers, the beautiful murals that had my wife's great-grandmother depicted on them were taken down, and the velvet off of the altars and the gold leafing off the seating rooms. It was hard for me. I did not understand it. And I kept asking my grandfather, who had such devotion there in the temple and supported the brethren every whit, I'd ask him, why are they doing this? Why are they taking the marble out and the velvet out and the carpeting that was made by pioneer women? My grandfather would say, the brethren have made this decision and we support them in this, and nothing more was said about it. But it still was hard for me as I knew those things were coming out. Many years after the temple was completed and I went in for the first time, no, it didn't have those original works of art, but I saw people who had not been able to